Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second lecture of computer vision. I always start with a quick revision of what we did in a previous lecture. So last week, we started looking at a definition of what computer vision actually is, looked at various examples, and discussed the structure of the course, including the schedule for the coming months. And I also recommended a couple of books for this course that you're most welcome to look into. And we looked at a few more terms, how computer vision relates to other disciplines and what this course focuses on, which is concretely an AI or machine learning view on computer vision. Looked at a couple of more terms like image processing, computer vision, how they differ. And we saw that computer graphics is the exact opposite of computer vision. We looked at a couple of questions, how to design vision systems. We saw some examples of perception and how this may confuse humans. And we saw some examples that are probably quite easy for humans to distinguish, but for a computer vision system that may be challenging if we don't put in training data for such use cases. We saw there are three levels of vision: low-level vision, intermediate-level vision, and high-level vision. We started last week with low-level vision. Today, we will continue with low-level vision and some intermediate-level vision. And in the next lecture, we will continue with high-level vision. But there will be some points when we come back to some low-level properties like depth or optical flow. We looked at how the human eye works, and we saw why computer vision is challenging concretely because we deal, in essence, with an under-constrained inverse problem. That was the introductory chapter, and then we looked at how we represent digital images. Concretely, digital images are a discretization of reality, both in terms of the shape as well as the intensity of the pixels. And we saw we represent a pixel image usually when in terms of a matrix. One matrix if it's grayscale images, three matrices, for example, if we have RGB images. And we looked at different image representations for color images and how they differ. We looked at the famous Lena image and saw what happens if we add noise to it, and then we wondered how we can filter out the noise, for example, with a local average filter. We applied it. We saw there are plenty of other filters, and from a more abstract perspective, we are dealing with convolutions, looked at their definitions, and this is something you would discuss in great detail if you take a machine vision course, say, for example, from an electrical engineering or signal processing perspective. But in computer science, we like discretization. So we look at different representations, and these integrals largely turn into sums then. We saw a different representation for the local average filter, and we saw there's lots of terms that are eventually synonyms in this context, like a convolution, filter, kernel, mask, operator, maybe even more terms, and we probably just treat them as synonyms in this course. And we saw the identity filter, the box blur, the Gaussian blur in various sizes. We saw how we can even sharpen images. And then we looked at one particular problem, which is edge detection. And for edge detection, we looked at this example. Edge detection is one of the low-level vision tasks, and which is then used in order to find more complex features. It's a very initial step you do in a lot of vision tasks. And we saw why edge detection is challenging, and we discussed the Sobel operator in greater detail as a simple edge detector. We saw it actually works quite okay. For this example here, we discussed its key components, which is the gradient along x and y. We saw also how we can use a library um, to apply the Sobel operator as well as other operators, and applied it to a sample image. And then we briefly looked at the canny edge detector as a more complex one uh, in order to do edge detection. We saw there are plenty of more edge detectors, and it was your task for at home to maybe implement some of the simple ones that we discussed. We use a library and do experiments with this. Has any of you tried to implement this stuff, or have you run some libraries and noticed anything, maybe just with a thumbs up or something, if you have spent some time on this? And if you'd like to share any of your insights, maybe just let us know here in the chat, or you can turn on your mic if you want to share any of your experience. So if you want to briefly share some of your insights, just turn on your mic now. I'll wait a few seconds. If you don't want to share your stories, then we'll just go ahead. About the organization of the course, so we're doing a lecture today, and next week we will not have the lecture on Thursday, because on Friday you will have a chance to pick robots if you want. We're still a few weeks away from defining your group projects, but some of you may be interested in a robot vision project, and you may wish to experiment with the robots. So that's next week on Friday, so we don't have the lecture on Thursday. If you don't pick the robot, use the time for extra revision. We're thinking about a vision project already. Who of you would actually be interested in a robot? Maybe some green reaction or green sticker or thumbs up if you wish to pick a robot, or thumbs down, red sticker if you're not interested in robots, which is also perfectly fine, because the robots, they lead to some extra work, but probably also a better learning experience. And one student sent me a private message and writes that he or she implemented a local average filter, blurring, sharpening, and a Sobel operator using the NumPy arrays as matrices. So I think that was a very good exercise then to understand some of this better. And yes, use libraries like NumPy and Python. Don't implement all these linear algebra operations on your own with never-ending loops. Use these objects like NumPy arrays, and eventually it's fairly doable with not too much code. So there are quite some of you who are interested in robots. That's cool. And you'll have your chance next week on the Friday. So next week, we don't have the Thursday lecture, and we'll have this lecture again in 2 weeks from now. Today, we will look at regions of images and segmentation. We'll also look at feature detection. Maybe we'll look into object recognition, but we'll just see how we're progressing today. But object recognition is something, as well as the convolutional neural networks, we would focus on in the next lecture in 2 weeks from now. So our focus today is intermediary vision here for segmentation. We also look at a few more advanced features. And then in 2 weeks' time, we will use these advanced features and segments in order to build object recognition systems. And there are lots of ways how we can build object recognition systems. And we'll see various approaches, and then we'll focus on convolutional neural networks to build such systems. And we'll contrast the neural networks to the other approaches, because there's quite some changes when it comes to features and so forth, how the neural networks work. But this is something we'll see largely in 2 weeks from now in the following lecture. Today, we will continue with this course and look at regions of images and segmentation. First of all, we will see what segmentation actually is. We look at different approaches, how we can build segments. We'll look at perceptual grouping, at Gestalt theory briefly. So these are just two smaller subchapters. And then we look at different segmentation approaches. We even will see some machine learning approach to build segments, concretely clustering algorithms. And then we can actually apply this clustering approach in order to compress images. It's not a vision task, more like an image processing task, but in order to do vision, we also need to do image processing. And it turns out our segmentation algorithm can easily be reused in order to compress images, which is fairly interesting. So this is the focus of this chapter. And then the next chapter, we'll look at more advanced features. So what is now actually a segment in an image? The goal of segmentation is that we want to identify groups of pixels that somehow fit together. What does fitting together actually mean? This is something we will discuss today. But for now, from a high-level perspective, we will just say that pixels somehow fit together based on some criteria. And these separate segments would allow us to split the image into different regions or into something we may call objects that are somewhat coherent. But this term object, you could also just see as a region or part of the image, because we're not yet into classifying these objects. For now, we will just split our pixels into various regions that somehow fit together, and they would be processed further. Segmentation is often actually a pre-processing step in vision, because we will split the image into various regions that fit together, and these individual objects or regions would then be processed further, for example, for an object recognition or some other tasks. So it's something in the intermediary vision, because we start with low-level vision to identify very simple features, and then we can split the image into various regions through segmentation, and then process the segments further, which is a high-level task then. There's one example here. What we see on the left are cells, and some regular cells, and we see the other cells, which could be, for example, cancer or some anomaly. And I want to process this further. So one of the first tasks I want to do is to separate these objects from the background, because the background is not white, it's somewhat bluish. And we have these cells which are okay, they are relatively small. They look like this, and we have these big cancerous or anomalous cells, and we see they're simply bigger. So one approach to process this could be a so-called binarization, and the binarization allows us to separate the objects from the background. Based on what you have learned last week, we have a digital image, and for now, this image is an RGB image, where we have three colors. How would you take the RGB image and eventually do a binarization so that we just separate everything from the background? Anyone has an idea and want to share their thoughts with us? If so, you can send this to the chat, or you can just turn on your mic and share with us how you would be splitting the objects from the background. If you feel you don't need to implement this as code, but if you have an idea how this could be done, maybe share your insights with us. Maybe thumbs up, green sticker if you feel you have an idea, or red sticker, thumbs down if you don't have an idea.
Maybe we have some contrast. Say the blue spots are darker, and maybe by this we can separate it.
So darker, okay. I'll just collect a little bit what was shared in the chat. One student says by color contrast. So maybe you can elaborate a bit what that means. One student says you want to get the average color of the whole image and everything that is brighter gets colored white, otherwise it gets colored black. One student says we should apply something to the Sobel operator where we subtract the segments having the same color. So lots of different ideas. One student says with the value of each pixel in grayscale. And this is also what I would actually do. Edge detection that we saw last week could be done to somehow separate the edge of the object from the rest, but we actually don't need this as the first stage. As the first stage, I would first of all convert the RGB image into a grayscale image. Now you're wondering, how can I convert an RGB image into a grayscale image? So for RGB, I have the 3 channels in my image. And remember each channel, so red, green, and blue, can be between 0 and 255. And to convert an RGB image into a grayscale image, the simplest thing that I can do is I just per pixel, for each pixel, I add the R, G, and B values, which would then could be more than 255, and I would just divide by 3. And then I would have a valid grayscale that falls into my 0 to 255 range. So for each pixel, add the R, G, and B channel values, submit, then have the sum and divide the sum by 3. And you would do this for every single pixel, and then you have converted the RGB image into a grayscale image. Grayscales are now between 0 and 255. And I would need to find some threshold in order to do debinarization. So I could maybe pick, for example, a threshold of 100, and every value that is 100 or greater than 100 would be white, because 255 would be white. So everything that is 100 or above, I would map to 255 would be white, and every pixel value that is under 100 would be changed to 0, which would be black. You need to figure out if that threshold of 100 actually works. Maybe the threshold could be 50, maybe it could be 200. That depends on the use case. But just working with such a threshold on the RGB image will actually give us a very good binarization. And then we could continue working with this. And what we see in terms of the cancerous cells, at least for an initial further processing, we could take very, very large cells and very, very small ones. They could be cancerous. The other ones could maybe be okay. Maybe it doesn't work for every single cell here, but it could already probably be quite a good initial classification. So thanks for all your inputs in the chat and via audio. Feel free to implement something like this at home, just with the tools you have used so far, like the NumPy arrays, and then you convert the RGB image into a grayscale image. I just told you how to do this, and then apply the thresholding on the grayscale images. And you could work with different thresholds and see if it makes any difference. There's another example of segmentation, for example, for autonomous driving. So we have an autonomous car, it has a camera, and it takes a photo of the scene, and then we apply segmentation. How exactly segmentation works is something we will see today. We'll see various algorithms, but what will happen is we will eventually have one segment for this car, we have one segment here for this car, we have a different segment for the road, we have a segment for this house, we may have a segment for the sidewalk, and maybe a couple of other segments. You could think about building segments based on color, so how actually pixels or how the color of a pixel relates to its neighbors, and this could allow us to build segments. We see the segments in the lower figure, or in the lower part of the figure, and we already see there is a classification here. The classification is not the actual segmentation step, it's one subsequent step, because you would apply a segmentation and you would just have these different segments. But in order to know what the segment is, say it's a road, it's a sidewalk, it's a car, whatever, or a fence, This would be done by the object recognition later. So you take the segment and feed it into object recognition. This is something we'll do in the next lecture. Today, we're starting with the segmentation. And the one approach to do segmentation can be perceptual grouping. Perceptual grouping is related to how humans see and how humans partition certain subsets in a scene that we see. And we'll look at a couple of examples and just see how you would actually perceive certain groups of objects or certain settings and how you would intuitively build groups. And such knowledge could be built in a vision system, maybe in terms of rules or by using training data and when you use a machine learning approach. And there's also this saying in the literature that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Maybe you have ever heard a sentence like this: the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What this refers to is that we look at a phenomenon or we look at a scene and we would look at the individual parts, the distinct parts, but when you aggregate these distinct parts, you also get something. And we say the whole is greater than the sum of its parts because when you aggregate these parts, then you actually get more insights. And from a perspective from psychology, there's this so-called Gestalt theory that was proposed around 1890 by a philosopher, and it denotes experiences that require more than the basic sensory capacities in order to comprehend. This is not a psychology course. However, we'll look at some of this Gestalt theory, at least some of the examples, and we want to see how you perceive this. And we can try to infer some rules from this when we build vision systems. So from Gestalt theory, maybe you have seen these kind of examples here. You have this object and you have that object, and you would intuitively assume that this line here for the upper object is longer than that line for the lower object. This is something that people would intuitively think. Would you, when you see this example for the first time in your life, would you also intuitively believe that this line is longer than the line in the lower image? If so, thumbs up or green sticker. If you would also perceive this, or thumbs down, red sticker, if this was obvious to you that this was not the case. So all the responses would actually be that you would perceive it this way, that this was actually longer than this. And when you measure it, you see that these two lines are just the same length, but because you have these outer ones, because of these outer objects, which are in the upper image to the opening to the left and right, and in the lower object, you have these parts too, but they are not opening to the outside, but they're opening to the inside. So we see the whole is actually more than the sum of its parts, because we not just look at the individual parts, but we actually glue them together. And we see that somehow for this one, this line in the middle seems longer than for the lower object. And there was also a comment here in the chat that when you look at that for the first time, you would assume that due to the close proximity. And there is another example from Gestalt theory. So you have this object at the top and you have this object at the bottom, and you draw in two lines and you look at, so these lines are just to the top and bottom of the set of the middle, and you would actually think that the distance of these two lines, so what I'm highlighting now, was actually more than if you just invert this, and you would actually have these lines meeting in one center and spreading out from there, and you would draw in again two lines that have the same distance than up there, but it actually would maybe look smaller. You would maybe think for the upper image that that distance is more than for the lower image, but they actually have exactly the same distance. So again, here, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And in this Gestalt theory, there are different laws. We're not looking at all the laws. We'll just look at a few of them and a few examples. And there are a number of laws, like the law of proximity, similarity, good continuity, closure, symmetry, simplicity, and common fate. We'll look at one example and see what this law is actually about. So the law of proximity says that stimulus elements which are closer tend to be perceived as one entity. And we could say, well, we have these 16 squares in this 4 times 4 matrix, but they are actually closer on the y coordinate, and they are further away on the x coordinate. So we have small distances here in the height, but in the width, we have large distances. And somehow, intuitively, we would assume that these are sort of groups, that this is one group, then we have another group in the vertical, and the last group in the vertical. So we would somehow perceive them as entities in the vertical, but they are separate in the horizontal, just because of proximity. There's another law, the law of similarity. So we would assume that similar elements tend to be part of a unit. We see something like this. We have squares and we have circles, and we just combine them, that we have a row of squares, a row of circles, another row of, the row of circles, a row of squares, then a row of circles, and so forth. And we see they may have more or less the same distance in x and y, but somehow we directly assume that these circles fit together, that these squares belong together, and so forth, just because these objects look similar, and this is how we tend to build a group. Similarity can be more than the shape. It could be the color, it could be the gray level, it could be orientation or other things, not just shape, in which we perceive elements that fit together as groups. This Gestalt theory are essentially rules. And if you have a vision problem, in which we'll see various vision problems later today and in this course, and for some of them, maybe you could just build rules based on Gestalt theory in order to build, for example, segments. You can do segmenting with machine learning, but for some problems, maybe you can just build simple rules, maybe in a controlled environment where you know which kind of objects will appear in the image. And you could think about Gestalt theory in order to build the segments, and then have fairly easy rules in order to recognize your segments. So typically, you would also need to add some domain expertise, not just these simple laws, but maybe these laws can be a starting point for some of your vision problems. There are modern methods like neural networks that we will discuss next week, and they actually work quite different because they don't use such rules like Gestalt theory, but rather we build towards more high-level attributes incrementally, because we will learn from the low-level features or low-level pixels, increasingly more complex features on our own. So we wouldn't, this would be quite a different approach than using this Gestalt theory. But think about it, maybe for some vision problems that you come across, you can build fairly simple rules in order to do the segmenting, and you don't need a very complex approach like a neural network that requires lots of training data and resources. Now we'll look at some other segmentation approaches, and we will also slowly come to an algorithm that will prove to be very helpful for this course. In particular, also for a number of problems. And in general, when you build segmentation approaches or when you look into what's available in the literature, there are numerous methods that have been proposed, but a lot of segmentation approaches, they can be split into various categories. For example, there are so-called merging algorithms. And merging algorithms, they try to build increasingly more complex segments, starting from low-level pixels, and then they look at the neighboring pixels. They try to build larger segments for pixels that still fit together, and at some point they are bored when these segments have been built, but nothing around it anymore would fit into that. So these are merging algorithms. It's actually a bottom-up approach because you're starting with the individual pixels, and then at some point you're bored when you're unable to build larger segments. Bottom-up. You know, if you took algorithms and data structures with me, you definitely have heard about bottom-up algorithms. The opposite would be top-down algorithms or splitting algorithms, where we actually start with the whole image and we would try to split it into non-uniform regions. So we take non-uniform regions and we would break them up into smaller areas, and we would stop breaking these areas into smaller areas once actually we have uniform regions available. That's just the opposite direction. So you can either do a bottom-up or a top-down. There are also algorithms that try to combine both. So there are combinations of top-down and bottom-up, or merging and splitting, as you will see today. But you somehow need to define your uniformity criterion. So how would you define that actually two regions or two pixels, whatever, belong together? And if it belongs together, you would maybe keep merging, or you would, for example, stop splitting once you have regions that actually fit together, and you wouldn't split that further into smaller ones. The uniformity criterion depends largely on your use case, how you would define it. One approach could be, for example, color. It could be other things, for example, intensity. And typically, you have to set some of these uniformity criterions on your own. With some problems, you can simply learn it from the data. Sometimes you may need to set some thresholds, so there are different approaches for that. One very simple approach for segmentation can be segmentation by histogram. So from now on, we will work with grayscale images. Remember, for a grayscale image, we typically said that each pixel is represented as a byte. So we have 256 possible intensities. 0 is black, 255 is white. And in between, we have various grayscales. So what we could do is we could build a histogram, and we could try to count how often a pixel with a certain value appears. For example, we would count how many pixels in our image have value 0. How many pixels have value 1? How many pixels have value 2? Up to how many pixels have value 255. So we would essentially build 256 bins, and we could try to plot the histogram. What we see here is a grayscale image of this leaf. And it's a grayscale image, so we would see there are some dark parts here, but they are not super dark, so not super black. And there are not that many pixels that are totally white because this background is not perfectly white. It is very bright, but not just value 255. And we could try to calculate our histogram, and we can try to visualize the histogram. This is here on the right, and we see there is a huge peak around very, very bright colors or very, very bright intensities that appear very, very often. So somewhere in the range of 235 to 250 approximately. We see a lot of pixels have a very, very high intensity. This would be the background pixels largely. We also see there are some pixels here in this part of the leaf where the leaf is very bright. And we see we have another peak, but it's not as sharp as the other peak with intensities around 100 to 160. And this would be largely the pixels that are sort of perceived as dark here. They're not super black, but dark. And with this histogram, we could try to segment our leaf from the background. We could, for example, as an initial approach, say one segment would be for these very, very high intensities. And these very high intensities would largely be the background. And all the other pixels that are under the threshold could be the leaf. If I try to do that, I can even try this with, for example, two thresholds. So I would split that spectrum into three parts. What I can see is I could pick very, very bright pixels somewhere in this region, and this would allow me to separate the leaf quite well from its background. But I also see there are some pixels, for example, around here, because we see the peak is very sharp, but there are some more pixels that have a very bright color, but not as bright as the background. Those ones could be the ones around the edge of our leaf. And then all the other pixels, maybe the ones as of or like under 190, something like this. This would be most of the leaf. So we could say we could pick actually also a very large threshold, maybe around 230 or something like this. This could help us to split the leaf from the background. But finding that threshold is probably not that easy. We need to do a few tests because if we pick a threshold like this, like maybe 210, then it could happen that we are actually separating not the whole leaf from the background, but we also would be separating the core or the edge of the leaf because that one has also very bright intensities. Not as bright as the background, but still bright. So finding these thresholds is something we need to look at and probably test it for a few thresholds. I've just explained how the histogram segmentation works, how to calculate the histogram and how it applies to this example here. Is this clear to all of you? Because we will need more histograms maybe later, and we will look at lots of other segmentation approaches. Maybe just confirm with a thumbs up or thumbs down if you understood the idea of the histogram, and we looked at these different thresholds, and the thresholding may be a bit challenging in order to actually separate the whole leaf from the background, because we also have this edge area, which is challenging. So I only see confirmations from your side, so it seems it's clear. It's actually, so I see we have about 60 students joining this live session. We have like 230 students or even more that have signed up for this course on iLearn. So lots of students are probably watching the recording. But I would obviously be happy if more students join the live session because the live session is meant for discussion. We do some quizzes together and all of this. So if you join the live session, it would be good. Otherwise, obviously, you can watch the recordings on YouTube, but do watch the recordings and don't wait until the project. So this was our image from just before in the histogram, and we could try to add salt and pepper noise to our image. We've seen salt and pepper noise last time, so we add dark and bright pixels throughout the image, just like if we spread salt and pepper on an object. And we actually see the histogram changes a lot. One thing that changes, first of all, is the Y scale. So you see the Y scale on the initial low noise image was something from 0 to 18,000. So we have, for example, in this pixel image, about 16,000 pixels that have intensity around 240 or something like this. And if we spread the salt and pepper noise, it's very important that the Y scale has changed too. So the Y scale is now per pixel something like between 0 and 2500. It's still the same number of pixels, but we've added noise, so we actually have spread out this with quite a lot, with varying intensity of dark pixels and varying intensity of bright pixels. And what we see is this histogram here. So we still have two peaks, but these two peaks are actually not as clear as they were before, because we have lots of other pixel values around here, very dark ones, and these two peaks don't separate too well anymore because of all the noise that was added here. So if we now try our segmentation approach on this image, it will be far more difficult than before, because we would need to find a proper threshold, but also applying this threshold will not directly separate this anymore, because we have also very dark pixels spread throughout the background. We have very bright pixels spread throughout this image. So if we have a noisy image like this, directly applying our segmentation approach from before wouldn't look great at all anymore. Do you remember from last week how we can try to wash out the noise? If you remember how we can try to remove some of the noise, send this to the chat or turn on your mic, just as a quick revision, because we looked at such algorithms last week. One person says the local average filter. Yes, that's a good example, and we saw plenty of other ones. This was just the blurring. We've looked at also some Gaussian blurring as maybe a more advanced one. So if you want to do segmentation using the histogram on this noisy image, you would first have to apply some kind of blurring. Maybe the local average filter will not work too great. You could also try to use maybe a median filter, which could maybe help us to separate this better. So you'd need to try different filters. The Gaussian blur you could use as well, but I don't think it will make much of a difference compared to the local average filter, because we just have too much salt and pepper noise in here. So we really have to get rid of this on the background. Maybe a median filter could be more helpful, or some thresholded filter where you need to define the thresholds on your own. And once you have tried to clean the noise or reduce the noise, then you would do the segmentation. Very important. But these are the kind of things you can also try out. Like next week, we don't have the lecture because you have time to pick the robots. Maybe next week you also wish to implement something like this. Some students implemented in the last few days. Some of the filters from last week, you could try to implement something like this as a practice, because all of this will help you to do better projects in a couple of weeks if you have some more experience from this. There is other noise, like lighting can also create noise. And while before our image, we had very good uniform lighting, if we now add poor lighting, we see this could lead to a very, very different histogram, because only the center of the image gets enough illumination, and not too much actually, and the outer parts are quite dark. So the lighting is very poor compared to before, and we actually get a really bad histogram. Do you think such a histogram can still be used reasonably to separate our leaf from before? If you have just this histogram, do you think this histogram is useful or not? Thumbs up, thumbs down, green or red sticker. Some have already sent a red one. And that is perfectly correct. I don't think this histogram is any useful, because you have dark pixels here, you have dark pixels there. And if you now try to do your segmentation, say with two thresholds or something like this, we see it doesn't work at all. We have very, very bright pixels that we can try to filter out, but all the other stuff doesn't really help us. We see the leaf cannot be really separated from the background because we have around the same intensities here as on the leaf. So this doesn't work out very well. And lighting is definitely something that we as humans can deal with very well, something we also discussed last week a little bit. But a lot of computer vision systems, they cannot handle changing lighting conditions very well. So if you are in a controlled environment, like in a factory, whatever, ideally you would have these vision systems somehow in a separated box in which you have constant and controlled lighting. This will definitely simplify your system because I've seen other vision systems, for example, that had were in factories and there were big windows on the roof of the factory, and based on how the sun moved during the day and if there were clouds or not, the lighting conditions changed, and this made the vision systems far more tricky. So if you can control lighting, you will not run into a problem like this. However, if you use your vision systems in the wild, so meaning at home, outside, in varying locations, then lighting will be a problem. Sometimes you can build smart approaches trying to separate out the lighting issues to some extent. Sometimes you would maybe add some calibration systems. Some of the early vision systems that I built while I was a student, I also added some, like I remember one of the first systems that I wrote was during the afternoon at home. I still remember this when I sat in my student residence when I was around your age, and then the stuff worked well. And when I tried running it in the night, it didn't work well anymore because it was dark outside and I had less sunshine coming in. And then I've added a calibration. So initially, I would do a calibration of the system, and I found some rules of how I can set these thresholds automatically based on a calibration, and then the system worked well when it was dark or when there was less sunshine. And then in the morning, if I wanted to run the system again, I had to calibrate it again to these conditions. It was an easy hack to fix it, at least temporarily, to add this calibration. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes you have a controlled environment. Sometimes maybe you need to look at more sophisticated approaches. But don't underestimate the impact of lighting also on your projects. But there are smart solutions to partially address this. There is another segmentation approach. It's called a quadtree. And a quadtree is something you sometimes would see in a computer vision, in a computer graphics course for some problems, but you may also see it in computer vision courses. And a quadtree is an algorithm that can be used as a segmentation approach in which we segment and then we merge. So it combines segmentation, we're splitting and merging. And I said this before that we have splitting algorithms, we have merging algorithms. And this is actually a combination of both approaches. And what you do with a quadtree is you would split the image into smaller and smaller regions. And once you have stopped with this, you will try to merge these smaller regions into larger ones as long as you still can. It's actually, in a way, this can be implemented. It's actually some kind of tree search, and numerous efficient algorithms for a quadtree have been published in the last few decades. So it's actually a very interesting algorithm that combines splitting and merging. Now that we have briefly talked about the quadtree, we will spend more time on a machine learning algorithm. It's the k-means clustering algorithm. Who of you has come across k-means before? Maybe thumbs up or green sticker or red sticker, thumbs down. We have many students here from our AI programs, so many of them have probably seen k-means before, but we also have students from other programs, not just our typical AI students. So I said about 230 students signed up for computer vision this year. maybe about 130 or so from our AI undergrad programs, both the German and English language one. But we have about another 100 students who take this as an elective, for example, exchange students, but also students from other programs. So I'll briefly introduce k-means, what its idea is. We will look at how the algorithm or what the algorithm looks like. We'll look at some examples. We will contrast it to other clustering algorithms, and then we will actually see how we can use it for compressing images. So k-means is an unsupervised algorithm. Unsupervised algorithms are one class of machine learning algorithms in which we work on unlabeled data, and we have m observations. Again, here I try to use my notation throughout the course, and some references would use n for the number of examples or observations. I personally prefer m, and n would be for the number of features in an observation. So I prefer m for the number of examples and n for the number of features. Some people just swap them. That's why I briefly want to highlight it. And we have our observations, x with an index I, and it's an upper index with parentheses around it. And we have m many, and the x is in bold because it may have multiple entries. And this x can be could be images, could be pixels in an image. It can be any kind of observations. So it's not just constrained to machine learning, it's not just constrained to computer vision, but to various machine learning tasks and different data. We will later visualize our observations as 2D observations, but so each entry would have an X and a Y coordinate, but it can be more. It could be pixels, it could be images, it could be whatever. So these X can be relatively complex. And what we want to do is we want to cluster these observations into k many clusters. And k is less than or equal to m. For example, we have 1,000 examples and we want to cluster them into 100, whatever, cohesive clusters. How many clusters you want is totally dependent on your use case. It's still highly generic. We will later apply this to vision. And each cluster has a mean, and this mean is a mu with also some index, and it's also bold because it also has multiple dimensions. Imagine our observations are XY coordinates, so locations, and we have different clusters, for example, 3 clusters, then each cluster has a mean. So the cluster would also need, or the mean of the cluster would also need an XY coordinate, but could be other entries too. That's why it's in bold, because it may be multiple entries. And we need to start with some initial coordinates of our cluster, which are usually random. So this algorithm is non-deterministic. It's a stochastic algorithm. And we'll briefly discuss the algorithm, and then we look at a few examples. So I want to say we have k many clusters. So we have clusters 1 to k, and we have the means mu1, mu2, up to mu k. And we say we deal with real values in each entry. So mu1, mu2, mu k, they are randomly initialized, and each of them has n many real values which are random because we have n many dimensions in our examples. Could be 2, could be 5, depending on whatever. Could also be just 1 if we just deal with one-dimensional data. But we define it just in a highly generic way. We deal with random means. And then we have an outer loop that just repeats until convergence, until actually these means converge. And then we have 2 inner loops. The first loop is we go through all the M observations, our M examples. And what we do is for each observation, we look at which cluster or which mean of the cluster is actually the nearest one to my example. So my example could be close to, or could be closest to cluster 5, cluster 1, cluster 100, depending on how many clusters I have. But I go through this for all my examples. That's why the loop goes from 1 to M. And for each example, we assign the closest mean or the mean of the closest cluster. We've done this now, and now we have the next loop that goes through each cluster. That's why we have k many clusters, so the loop goes from 1 to k. And now we update the mean of the cluster. So we go through, for example, cluster 1. We look at all examples assigned to cluster 1, because each example got assigned to some clusters, or some have probably been assigned to cluster 1. And we update the mean of that cluster j. So j goes from 1 to k. And we do this for all the clusters that we update the mean, and then the outer loop runs again. And now we have our M examples, and they will again each get assigned to the closest cluster. But because the loop before, the inner loop before, has changed the mean of the clusters, maybe some examples will now get assigned to a different cluster. And then again, we find the mean of each cluster, and this keeps going until we until we converge. And convergence mean that our means don't get updated anymore, and the examples or the assignment of the examples to the clusters does also not get updated anymore. And then we converge. We will look at an example now. Imagine we have various observations, and it's just in 2D. Each observation has an X and a Y coordinate. So the gray ones are our observations, and we have three clusters, a red one, a green one, and a blue one. If you face color blindness, so you struggle to distinguish between red and green, that's not a problem, because in the next part of the plot, we also put in boundaries. So we can just say this is one cluster, mean another one, and another one. So K is 3. And then we said, this is the random initialization. So we have just randomly assigned our means. They could also be just somewhere else in this figure. And then we said we assign each observation to the closest cluster. So this one would get assigned here. The ones around the blue would get assigned to the blue, and so forth. And this is what we see in the next subfigure. We see that each observation now got assigned to a cluster. And we even put in these boundaries so that we don't need the colors. We just see each observation get assigned to a cluster. Now, the next inner loop comes, in which we update the means of a cluster, because we have only one example assigned to the red cluster. So we see the mean of the red cluster is actually that one observation. For the green one, we have various examples assigned to it, 6 examples, so these 2 and these 4, and we would find the mean location. So we would slightly change the location of the center of the green cluster, which would slightly be moved here. It would be just moved a little bit down. And for the blue cluster, we would again update the location by taking all the examples assigned to the blue cluster, and we update the mean. Now that we have done this, the outer loop will run in its next iteration, and each example will get assigned to the closest cluster. So what will happen, for example, is that this green example that was first assigned to the green cluster will definitely get assigned to the red cluster because the mean of the red cluster is now here because that was just one example. So you keep running this until it converges, and once it's converged, we're done. Typically, k-means converges relatively fast. There are also some theoretical studies about convergence. And it works in more than 2 dimensions because here we have 2-dimensional data. It works in more dimensions. It works for more clusters, for more examples. Overall, it's a highly generic algorithm that can be used for lots of different problems. So someone wrote me that it's in your AI curriculum this semester. Maybe you can refer me to which course in your curriculum, if it's maybe your machine learning course that is, I think, offered in the same semester in parallel. Just let me know where in the curriculum you have the k-means algorithm. But this is not a machine learning course, it's a computer vision course, and we have more students than the ones from our AI undergrad programs. And that's why I wanted to briefly discuss k-means with you. So one student wrote, it's in your machine learning course, the one from the German language program taught by Professor Hough. One challenge is obviously you need to define how many clusters you want. The algorithm will not tell you how many clusters you should use. This is purely one of your choices you need to make from a perspective of requirements analysis. You would need to define if you want 5 clusters, if you want 2 clusters, whatever. When we later use this for image compression, we will define the number of clusters, but k-means will not find you the optimal number of clusters on its own. If you wonder about the error, so what's the error that you just reduce the error to the absolute minimum, meaning an error would be a distance of an example from its cluster center. If you want to keep that error to 0, then yeah, you would probably need to set the number of clusters equal to the number of examples. But that doesn't give us any new structure because machine learning is all about finding hidden structure in our data. So typically you want the number of clusters to be less than the number of examples. And remember, it's a non-deterministic algorithm. So we have randomly initialized these 3 centers. If you initialize these centers differently, for example, the green one would be down here, the red one up there, and the blue one in the middle, then you would most likely get a different result. It would converge differently. So you can implement this on your own, or you can use scikit-learn. We will see scikit-learn later as a machine learning library. And you will see this is non-deterministic. And if you run k-means on the same data set multiple times, most likely you will get somewhat different clusters. And we can see this here. We will compare now k-means with different clustering algorithms. So we have this actually looks a bit like a Minnie Mouse or Mickey Mouse. We have the head and we have 2 ears. And if you use this original data and you just wish for it to be clustered perfectly, you would use these colors. So the data here that we use is actually, it's an unsupervised problem. We don't have labels, but what we could just say, if we had our original data set, we could pick 3 clusters on our own. Probably this head would be one cluster. We would have this ear and that ear. And we have some squares, which are the outliers, examples that are very far off, but it's real data, so we have outliers. Ideally, we would like to ignore them, but our algorithms don't ignore the outliers yet. And if I apply k-means to the original data set, one outcome could be something like this. What do you think about the outcome that we got? Does it look okay to you? If it doesn't look okay to you, what doesn't look good in these three clusters? You can either write this, but you can also just turn on your mic and share with us where you agree and where you disagree with these clusters.
They have no outlier detection, so all the blue X's, they don't have a different color on the right side.
Okay. So outlier detection is not part of this yet. But how do you think these clusters here differentiate? So one cluster, what we see is this ear is way too big, as well as this ear. And actually, a lot of the pixels of these ears are actually taken from the head already. So it doesn't look too great. And we have these outliers, and these outliers actually have a lot of impact on the clusters. Like this outlier here actually leads to a problem that this cluster gets very, very big. What you can see in here is if you zoom in, you will see a blue cross. And a blue cross is actually the center of this cluster. Like you have a red cross here, or you have a green circle. These are the cluster centers. And this center here is just way too off from its actual center because we have also these outliers. And what k-means learns, at least the initial k-means, it just learns circular clusters. Circular in 2D, it would be a sphere in 3D or some high dimensional sphere in 4D and more. But these outliers create lots of problems because they lead to very, very wide clusters. So the radius in this cluster gets extremely large, and it would actually result in a problem, as we see here, that we have lots of these examples. They fall into the cluster of the ear, should be part of the head, however. This was one possible outcome. If you run this again, you may get totally different clusters. It could maybe even happen that the head is split in two clusters and you have one cluster for the ears in some very unfortunate setting. And that's why it's non-deterministic. If you don't like the outcome, maybe just run it again and you get a better outcome. Remember, k-means learn spherical clusters. And a sphere is maybe not too great for this kind of problem, as well as not for lots of other problems. So a sphere in 2D is just a circle. In 3D, it's a sphere or a higher dimensional. There is a different clustering algorithm. It's called the EM clustering. What does EM stand for? EM stands for expectation maximization. Expectation maximization is a very, very important algorithm from signal processing that we use in various machine learning models. We will talk about EM later in this course, I think, when we look at temporal models, when we look at image sequence processing problems, and we look at the Kalman filter, we will refer to EM again. And EM, discussing it itself would probably take 2 or 3 lectures if we wanted to discuss it in detail. But this is something you would typically do in an advanced machine learning course. And the EM algorithm does actually what k-means does, but in a much more abstract way, because you have these two parts for building clusters and or for assigning elements to clusters and then finding the means of the cluster. What we do in k-means is actually just a variation of EM, just a simplification and specialization of EM. So EM is something far more generic, and it can be applied not only to clustering. Clustering is just an application of EM, but EM is a far more generic algorithm that can be applied to lots of other problems of finding parameters in models. Because what I want to find is, I want to find parameters like where the clusters actually are and how big they are. And if you apply EM to clustering, EM will not necessarily give you spheres, but actually ellipses. So EM applied to clustering would learn you ellipses and not spheres or circles. And that's why if you apply EM to this clustering problem here, you would usually get a far better outcome than with k-means. Depending on how you implement EM clustering, it may still be actually non-deterministic because somehow you need to set your initial parameters. So you not always get that super good result. You may also have to run it a few times, but you would clearly get, or in most cases when you run it, you would get a much better result because you learn an ellipsis, or you learn ellipses and not spheres. But EM itself is a complex yet super interesting algorithm you would discuss in detail in an advanced machine learning course. It's nothing we'll use here or discuss here. We would just apply EM to a few problems, and we will mention EM again later in this course in temporal models briefly. Now that we have discussed k-means, we can do something very, very interesting. Just as an application, we can apply EM. We can apply EM to compressing images. There's one example here of k-means can be applied to intensity segmentation. We will soon look at image compression, but first maybe briefly at intensity segmentation, because we see there are, if we want to see, for example, 3 segments, we could take the original image and we could try to see how the intensity spreads. And we see there's a human which has a very, very dark intensity. There are a few objects which are dark in the background, or a few pixels. And then we have very bright ones, and then we have this grass as something in between. And if we apply k-means to this one here, to this example, so it would mean we actually have 3 clusters. Our pixels have an intensity, and the pixels also have a location. And if we apply k-means to that problem, and we visualize the 3 segments or the 3 clusters, can it help us to maybe spread the photographer and most of its equipment quite well from the background? Not perfectly, because in the background we also have some very, very dark pixels. But as a first approach, maybe such a k-means intensity segmentation works quite okay. And there are lots of variations of k-means, like a fuzzy c-means, and lots of other variations. What I put here is a link to an example from MathWorks, where this is implemented or demonstrated for one possible example for this image here. Take a look at it if you're curious to see how k-means works for intensity segmentation and various variations of k-means. But we'll now come to something far more interesting. We will do image compression. In image compression, we have images that have lots of unique colors. So we have this image here. This one has, believe it or not, 96,615 unique colors. So we have lots of variations of red, lots of variations of green, blue, whatever. And now we want to reduce the size of the image. And when you look at image compression, what typically happens is that you have some lossy compression, because we somehow have to reduce the number of colors in here, because what we don't want to do is, first of all, we don't want to store in each pixel its unique color. We could do that. So in each pixel, we would need 3 bytes for R, G, and B. A somewhat smarter way could be is that we have a map of unique colors. And in that map, we store the 3 bytes, R, G, and B. And from each pixel, we actually map to the map. And there may be quite some pixels, say, in the sky that have exactly the same R, G, and B values. So we don't want to store in each location the R, G, and B values. Rather, we store a reference to a map. And in the map, we store the unique colors. So this is already a small improvement. It's not a compression yet. Yet, we are not storing the individual colors. Yet, for this image, we have 96,000 unique colors. And it turns out we can use k-means in order to reduce the image size by using k unique colors. So you have this image here, and now it's your task to reduce it, say, to 100 unique colors. And we're not using k-means yet. K-means will come next. How would you reduce this image that has 96,000 unique colors to, say, 100 unique colors? What would you do? Any suggestions how we could reduce the number of unique colors? If you have an idea, maybe thumbs up. If you have no idea yet, thumbs down. You can share your thoughts in the chat, or you turn on your microphone. This would be probably far more interesting if you want to share via audio with us of how you would identify or how you would somehow find 100 unique colors in here.
We could reduce the contrast, and then maybe we get less bright colors, and then we have more similar ones.
Okay, reduce the contrast. That's one approach. We could also maybe just randomly pick 100 unique colors, and then for each pixel, for the color in each pixel, find the closest random color, right? We could also do that. What could be some issues with picking random colors and then matching each color to the nearest random color? So one student says we could sort them into 100 basic colors, but how do we define these basic colors? And for depending, say, if we randomly pick these 100 colors, maybe sometimes it works well, or sometimes maybe it doesn't work well at all. And how do I define the 100 basic colors that are helpful? For some problems, or for some images, they may be helpful. For other images, maybe not. It turns out we can do this with k-means, and I will show you later how to implement it. But with k-means, we can say I want 64 colors, for example. So I have 64 clusters. And yes, initially these clusters are random because this is about k-means, it just randomly picks something in the spectrum. And then we could find the pixels that are the closest to the random centers. But you remember, k-means doesn't stop here, but then we actually amend the clusters because we do a mean of the cluster, and then we again check which pixels or which colors are the closest to the new means. So these initially picked centers of the clusters, which are just random, they get changed over time because we assign pixels to the center, but then we update these centers and assign the pixels again. So this is far better than just randomly picking some colors. Rather, we use k-means than just picking random colors that we cannot change anymore, but with k-means, we can actually amend the centers of the clusters. So this was 96,000 colors that are unique. And just with k-means, we get something like this. What do you think? Thumbs up for okay, thumbs down for overall not okay. Just as a first attempt. And maybe you can share with us what you like in this diff. So this was the original, and this is the update. Maybe share with us what you like and what you don't like when you compare these two images. Just flipping a bit back and forth. So one person says it's too lossy, okay? The sky is, I noticed the biggest problem in the sky. That's totally true. So we see this is too shady, a little bit on the water as well, but we see largely the color transitions in the sky. It looks okay for the actual objects here, for the trees, for this building. There I notice little difference. There is a little bit in the color tone, but I notice also the biggest difference in the sky. But it looks far better than just randomly picking 64 colors, because this was the original, and k-means looks like this, and the random ones look like that. And I think the k-means looks far better than the random ones. Random one also doesn't look too bad, actually, but we can do with k-means far better than with random. So this is k-means for 64 colors. We can use k-means to further reduce this to, for example, 10 colors. Obviously, there's a big loss because we only have 10 unique colors now, but it doesn't look too bad yet because we can still see the objects quite okay. Maybe it's a very sharp change in the sky, but for the sky, we probably only have 2 colors available. And at some point, there is some transition then. But k-means with 10 colors, believe me, looks far better than if you use 10 colors randomly. And we can reduce this to 5 colors with k-means. We're still able to see our actual object in the trees, maybe not much of the background anymore, like this kind of stuff. But with only 5 colors, I'm sure that k-means works far better than if we randomly pick 5 colors. And we can reduce this to 2 colors, which is eventually just some binarization. Are you impressed that it still looks quite okay for 10 or 5 colors compared to random ones? If you think this doesn't look too bad for 5 to 10 colors, maybe thumbs up. If you don't like it at all, let us also know. It's fine. But I think for 5 to 10, it works quite well. And with 2, we actually get a binarization. So how can this be implemented? There's a little bit of code here, and most of the code is just some boilerplate code converting the pixels back and forth. We'll briefly look at it. Feel free to implement it at home. You find numerous examples like this on the internet. So we need NumPy for dealing with our matrices. We need matplotlib for visualizing all of this. And we need k-means as a clustering algorithm. And we use sample images from k-means. Sample images from scikit-learn. There's a little bit of boilerplate code. I'll just tell you what the essence is. We are loading our image. The image is called china.jpg. We define 64 colors. We compress our image and we plot it. And in order to compress it, we need to do a few steps that I'll briefly explain. So key essence is compressing the image. In compressing the image, I pass the image and a number of colors. And what I'm doing here is I am just making sure the image values are not between 0 and 255, but actually between 0 and 1. So we're just scaling the channels, because then these algorithms typically work a bit better with it. We are just getting the shape of the image, which are the 3 dimensions, W, H, and D, which is the original shape. We are reshaping the image. You can feel free to try out at home what the reshaping is. We're just bringing our data into a slightly different structure. So it's just some boilerplate code that we need. And later we will reshape it again. But you can either look at that or run it in a debugger or look what the reshape does. Here it's just some boilerplate code, so we can actually put the data easily into k-means. What we are doing is we're calling k-means, and we say the number of clusters is the number of colors we defined. And we are fitting this not on our whole image array, but rather we have a sample of images. This just, or a sample of the image array, not images, the sample of the pixels. So we don't take all the pixels, rather we take 1,000 random pixels in there. So shuffling is we just shuffle our image array and we take the first 1,000 elements. And we do k-means the training on the sample. We only do this to speed it up. It will give us a slightly worse result, but it will run massively faster. And we fit it, so we run k-means on the array sample, and then we use the k-mean centers that we found, and we use it to predict on the whole image array. So we're using the actual image array in the right order, and we are predicting the closest color to the centers, but finding the centers was not done on all the unique colors, but rather the first 1,000 pixels. So it will give us a slightly worse result, but believe me, it runs much, much faster. You can also try this out at home and see how much faster it runs. And then we have predicted these closest colors to our centers, but we have our image in this array sequence because we had used this reshape, so we can easily plug it into k-means. And all we need to do is we just need to recreate the image. For this, we have an extra function to recreate this. You can either use it or study it on your own, but eventually it's just some boilerplate code, so we get the original format of the data again. The interesting part of what we've just done in this course is actually the k-means here and the predicting, as well as the speed up, which is this one. You can use the speed up or you can eliminate it. You can run this on your computer and just see how much faster it actually runs. From the result that we will get a slightly worse result, but actually it runs far quicker. So we have these examples here, and we see we actually get a fairly good image, even for 5 to 10 colors by compressing it. And for 2, we get the binarization. So my advice is for you, since also we don't have lecture next week, some of you will pick a robot, maybe the other ones try to implement this here at home, make some variations to the number of colors, try to remove the speed up and see how it works. Now, after the break, we will look into feature detection, and we've already looked at very simple features last week in the lecture, for example, edges. And today, we will look at more features. We will look at RANSAC, a very generic model that can be applied to vision and to lots of other problems. And then we will look at more specialized models. For example, the Hough transform, which finds us straight lines in an image, so more than an edge, but straight lines. And corners are also very distinctive features in an image. And the Harris corner detector is one approach to finding corners. We will look at RANSAC a little bit. We look at the Hough transform in greater detail, and we will discuss in super great detail the Harris corner detector and derive it step by step. So we have various levels that we will look into today. And then we actually have everything ready to look more into object recognition in the next lecture. So we've talked about features a few times already, and we saw that edges are features, but there are more features. And from an abstract perspective, a feature is an interesting part of an image. What makes a part interesting? That's something we'll see. And concretely, we're interested in local features. So local features are distinctive parts of an image, not the image as a whole, but local interesting parts. And local features are associated with object features. For example, if we have an object that we want to find, for example, edges or corners of that object will typically be local features if we try to find it, say, with a corner detector, an edge detector, whatever. Local features help us to actually generalize for scene representation because we can have lots of local features and we can try to aggregate them through, for example, a machine learning algorithm or something else. And we put in these local features, and this helps us to generalize for scene representation. Also, if we see such objects in a different scene, maybe from a different angle, and so forth. And typically, there are lots of local features in an image. For example, edges. You've seen this last week for various images. There are lots of edges, lots of changes of intensity in an image, and that's great. So we can actually find a lot of them and maybe pick the ones that are particularly interesting or try to filter out some of them. But there's often not a lack of local features. Like we have lots of edges, lots of corners, and this kind of stuff. And finding local features is something we can actually do quite efficiently. You've seen last week the Sobel operator as an example. Calculating this is actually straightforward, and also something if you need more or less real-time performance, so you need 25 images or more per second, you can do this quite adequately. And I've also shown you as a quick hint last time, but I said you should maybe look at that if you're curious how we can calculate a Sobel operator more efficiently, because we used this other matrix representation, but I just briefly looked at it last time. But there are often lots of tricks or hints how we can calculate local features more efficiently. And today we look, for example, at the Harris corner detector in great detail. That one, there are also lots of tweaks to actually speed it up. And there are lots of different types of features. I've already mentioned edges, corners. There are lines. That's something we'll see today as well. We'll look at blobs, ridges. All of these are local features, and they would typically be used then in higher level tasks for segments, for object recognition, and so forth. Applications just mentioned like object recognition, image matching, classification, object tracking. So if we have an image sequence problem, we need features of an object, and then we can try to track these features. When we look at image sequence processing, we're looking largely at very generic algorithms for this, and we could feed in some time series data. We could feed in some sequence of features of objects. So the algorithms you will see for image sequence processing, some of them are purely for computer vision, while some are highly generic. All we need to feed in are actually features and can maybe use a very powerful temporal model like a Kalman filter or something, which has nothing to do with computer vision. But if we feed in features of objects, then such models like a Kalman filter can work with it extremely well. So lots of applications of features. We will also, in the next lecture, look at neural networks. Neural networks, they learn features on their own as well as the actual task. So they combine multiple levels of vision in one big model. This comes with various benefits, but also with certain drawbacks. And we'll discuss and contrast this in next week's lecture, in the next lecture in 2 weeks. and see what the neural networks do differently. But computer vision is more than neural networks, and that's why we first of all look at these more traditional methods and then contrast them to neural networks. Finding features in an image looks straightforward, but still there can be lots of challenges. For example, if you find features of an object and in the next image that object is maybe rotated, or you look at it from a different scale. So scale would be how close is it to the camera, may appear smaller, larger. This may have impact on finding features, as well as if you rotate images. Translation means the object is somewhere else in the image, so maybe not always in the center, but in one of the corners or whatever. And ideally, when we have all of these variations like translation, rotation, and scale, and others that we will look at in a moment, we want the feature detection to be invariant to this. Invariant means even if there's rotation, translation, scale, we still want to get the same features. It's something that we as humans can do extremely well with our vision system and brain. Not always, obviously, there are limitations, but computer vision algorithms often struggle with this. And we will see lots of examples where some feature detectors are invariant to some of this and maybe not invariant to some others of that. But we not just want invariation to translation, rotation, and scale, but we also want feature detectors to be robust to, for example, lighting variations. We've seen this today already with segmentation. If we change the lighting in our setting, we may get totally different segments. And so we may get totally different features. A lot of features are actually about changes of intensity in an image. So if I change the lighting, then the intensity changes too, which may give me different features. Noise, there can be noise from lighting variations. There can be noise like salt and pepper noise from lots of different causes. All of this, we actually want our features detector to be robust to. Blurring could also happen, so maybe we have a loss of focus when taking the photo or a video. Quantization, so we have a loss of information in our processing. And ideally, we want our feature detectors to be robust against all of that too. But it's not always the case. So some feature detectors are robust to some of this while not being robust to others. And this will, for most of the feature detectors we'll discuss, we actually will discuss a little bit what they do, how they work, but also what they are invariant and robust to, and for which things they may not be that. And when they are actually, maybe some algorithms, some feature detectors are more robust to one thing, but maybe this comes with lots of computational complexity. Maybe we want to run the algorithm much faster, so we would maybe use a different one, which is less robust, but runs faster. So we need to make all of these considerations when picking and designing our algorithms. I have this scene image here from a road, and some of the objects we are interested in, they're actually characterized by the presence of straight lines. Say this could be an autonomous car, and it needs to know where to drive, so it needs to know where the road is. And here actually we have lots of straight lines, so we can separate our lane from the other lane. So finding straight lines could be interesting for a lot of vision tasks, which we will see very soon how to do that with the Hough transform. Now you're wondering, we've looked at edge detection and I want to find straight lines. Why don't I just run edge detection? Edge detection is a very early step to find edges, but maybe you have extra edge points, so you don't know where these edges actually go, to which line they may fit. Maybe they create some noise that you may struggle to find straight lines through your edges. Sometimes only part of a line is detected, and then you don't have all the edges in order to complete that line. So some parts may be missing. You need sort of to bridge that. And how would you do that? noise in the measurements, lighting variations, and lots of other scene parameters may influence that too. So I'm not against edge detection. Edge detection is super important, but it's not ultimately the solution to directly work with straight lines. It's maybe more like an earlier step, and now I need to see how I can turn such edges into straight lines. One approach, so I've just skipped the voting because I'll actually mention it when it's important. So voting is an approach in some of the models we're interested in. If you have combinations of features and you want to fit a model to a particular subset, or you fit models to possible subsets, and then you want to find which one is the most likely model. And for this, you need voting. It's a very generic procedure, but we briefly look at some algorithms first, and then we look at the voting, and then probably voting will become more clear, and we or you can go back to one slide with some generic information on voting. There is one algorithm that has actually nothing to do with computer vision. It's rather a very generic algorithm. It's called RANSAC. And RANSAC stands for Random Sample Consensus. And RANSAC is an iterative method that allows us to estimate parameters of a model from observed data. And real-world data always includes outliers. So we want to have an algorithm that works with real-world data, and real-world data will have outliers because of noise, lighting variations in vision. If it's some other sensor data, you may have noise for whatever reasons. And we want to be able to filter out the outliers so we can actually estimate the parameters of our model well. This can be used for lines, it can be used for lots of other things, and can be used for numerous problems outside computer vision. So what RANSAC does is it's a loop of various steps. When we have our observations of our examples, RANSAC will randomly select a group of these points. Then it will compute the transformation from that set, or we call this a seed group, from that set. We will then find inliers of the transformation. And so inliers is just the opposite of outliers. And if the number of inliers is sufficiently large for our model, then we recompute least squares estimate of the transformation on all the inliers, and we continue this. So we run this loop until we have found eventually enough inliers for a plausible model, and we have filtered out the outliers. And we keep the transformation that has the largest number of inliers, because we may do this with multiple sets of seed groups or multiple seed groups, and we pick the transformation with the largest number of inliers. I'll show you how this works now with an example, and then it will probably become more clear from an abstract perspective what RANSAC does. We'll look at this. We have a set, we have examples, which is this data set. It's all these circles. We also have these two red ones, but these red ones are the initial seed group. So we pick from our observations two random ones, which are these red ones. And later, for the other seed group, we pick two other random ones. And what we want to do now is we want to estimate a line in our data set. When we look at the data set, we see we are unable to find a perfect line through all the data points because there's just some noise. But it looks plausible that actually from the lower left to the upper right, we could put in a straight line and we ignore the outliers. For us as humans, this is quite obvious when we look at the data set. However, for a computer model, we somehow need to specify this. So we could say we pick two random points, the two red ones. We apply our transformations or our model, our straight line, and with some variation in there, we can have thresholds to both ends and see what would fall into this interval. How many examples would fall into this interval? Aside from the red ones to which we have applied our transformation, there are maybe two more circles that fit in. But a lot of the circles, a lot of the examples from our data set do not fall in. So maybe okay, but not too great. Now we take the same data set again, pick two other random examples like these red ones. We put the straight line in between the red ones again, and we now see a lot of the examples fall into this interval. And this is the voting. Voting would mean we count how many of these examples fall into this interval for subset 2 as well as for subset 1, but we would actually then pick the model for which this has worked the best, for which we have the highest count. This is obviously a toy data set. In a real-world data set, we have much more points, so we probably would not just do this twice for subset 1 and 2, but rather for more models or for more possible seed groups. And one issue could also be finding this threshold, could be maybe a few pixels, something we may need to customize in order to define this interval. So, but I guess, at least for this first example where we've applied RANSAC, you can see or get an idea of how voting would work and how we can actually handle the inliers as well as filter out the outliers. Maybe give me a sign, green or red, if this is something you got from this first example. If the example here makes sense to you of how we filter the inliers from the outliers and we were able to find our straight line. So, various positive reactions, no negative ones, so I assume this is clear. The RANSAC algorithm has a great advantage that it's a general method that can be applied to a large range of parameter estimation or model fitting problems, not just vision or straight lines, but to numerous other parameter problems. And it's actually fairly easy to calculate it as well as, or actually fairly to implement and to run it. And these are the pros, but there are also some cons. It cannot handle too much noise, actually. So if you have more noise than the actual data, so if you have a majority of noise, this will not work anymore. There are quite some problems where you actually may have a lot of noise, and then this doesn't work well anymore. So if you have too many outliers, your model or your RANSAC will not work anymore. There are obviously lots of variations of RANSAC, probably hundreds of thousands of variations that have been proposed in the literature. I also know some people who have contributed to variations of RANSAC and published this. So feel free to look like in Google Scholar if you want to see some papers on RANSAC. We are interested today in straight lines as a feature. So we will now see the Hough transform. It's an algorithm particularly made for finding straight lines in data. And this one is a totally different voting strategy that can handle a super high amount of outliers. So where you may have much more outliers than inliers, the Hough transform is something that can actually handle this for you. There's a lot of text here. It's just for your revision, or if you want to do some further reading. The Hough transform is used a lot in image analysis, computer vision, digital image processing for finding straight lines, where we have a lot of noise and we do a voting strategy. However, one downside is the Hough transform is extremely slow, or may not extremely slow, but quite slow compared to other approaches. So we either need to speed it up or we need to look at lots of variations of the Hough transform. But we start with the initial Hough transform as it was proposed decades ago. And what we see is we have this scene here, so this set of objects. We first run an edge detection, which may look something like this. We've seen last week how to find edges, for example, with the Sobel operator, the Kenny edge algorithm. And from this, we actually want to find straight lines and visualize them. So maybe an early approach could be something like this. Doesn't look too great yet because these lines are actually not complete. But what we actually want to find are all these like straight lines in here. And I'll show you now how this can be done. We will look at that from a very, very well visualized explanation of the Hough transforms. I have to say, when I was a student and followed a computer vision lecture, which also included like one lecture about the Hough transform, or not maybe one lecture, half a lecture, I struggled understanding the essence of the Hough transform, at least from that lecture. And then I found years ago this very interesting visualization. It doesn't include much maths at this point. Some maths will come in the next few slides, but it's a very visual way of how we can understand the Hough transform. So what we have here is an image, a scene. We have this apple, and we have a straight line, which is probably just, so the apple is on the floor or on a table, and that straight line is the end of the floor or the table and where it connects to the wall. We also see the illumination of the scene, so there's a lot of shade of the apple. So most of the pixels in here probably are not related to the actual apple. Most of the pixels are actually related to the apple and not related to the actual straight line. Now, I want to find a straight line, but most pixels have nothing to do with the straight line. One challenge. What I can do here is I can run edge detection. And edge detection would give me lots of edges, and I would just sample some of those pixels. So most of the edges that are detected are actually somehow around the apple, both also on the apple, because there are changes of intensity, the shade of the apple, and just a few edges or pixels of the edge are actually related to the straight line I want to find. With RANSAC, this wouldn't really work anymore because we wouldn't find much useful information in here. But with the Hough transform, we do. What we need to do now is we need to convert our pixels into a new representation, concretely in R theta space. Who of you has heard about R theta space? Maybe thumbs up or thumbs down if you have ever heard about R theta space. So one person has heard about this. Maybe tell us where you have heard about R theta space.
I don't know, I think this is like just to be econometry. For example, this is a radius and theta is an angle. And that's why we can get the coordinates.
That's correct. So maybe many of you have seen this in complex numbers when you learn to represent complex numbers in different spaces. And there's, for example, the polar coordinate system in which you can represent complex numbers. Who of you remembers the polar coordinates of complex numbers? It's certainly something you must have seen before if you studied complex numbers. Maybe thumbs up or thumbs down if polar coordinates ring a bell. So more positive responses. We will look at this now and how it works. So we have one point here. So this red point is one of the edges. And we can try to represent this in r theta space. So r theta space would mean we take the center and we want a straight line that goes through this pixel. For example, this blue line is a line that goes through one pixel here, which is one of the edges. And now I want to find this blue line in a way that if I take a line coming out of the center, so that when they intersect, that I have a 90-degree angle between the blue line the blue line must go through our point from the edge, and when we connect it to a line that comes out of the center, there must be a right angle, 90 degrees. If I find such a blue line, I have a distance r1, which is the distance of the other line that comes out of the center and intersects with my blue line at a 90-degree angle. So this is r, the distance r from the center, and there is an angle theta, which is this angle here of my straight line coming out of the center and intersecting with 90 degrees with the blue line. So there's an r and a theta. Now it turns out there are impossibly or infinitely many straight lines going through my point, like the green one, which also goes there. And I can find a new straight line coming out of the center, intersecting with that green line. And I will get a new distance, r2, and a new angle, theta. And I can do this now for lots of straight lines that all go through my first edge. So we are not finding our straight line behind the apple yet. This will come as a consequence. For now, I want to find many straight lines that go through my first edge, which is always the same point here. And I will compute for these lines my r and my theta. So there could be, for example, another one that goes through like this, for which I can find a new r and a new theta. I could find one that goes like this, and so forth. Are you all with me up to here? Maybe thumbs up, thumbs down. Because the Hough transform are many, many steps. Okay, good. And I can try, so I have these parameters r and theta for each of these straight lines. And I can now try to plot these parameters r and theta. So I make a new plot, r and theta, and I put a point there for my straight lines. Because the blue straight line has a certain r1 and theta 1. I put it here as a point. My green line has another r and theta. I put it in here. And I keep doing this for many straight lines through my first edge. So we're still with the first edge. I'm putting a lot of them in here. And for each straight line I put through my first edge, I plot it in r theta space. And I see some pattern, something that looks like a sine function. Now I have done this, so I can try to do an interpolation between these points. And I find this interpolation would be some curve looking like a sine. And what that sine represents is, it's the r theta representation of all possible straight lines through my first edge. So we're still only with the first edge. And what I find in r theta space as a function represents all the possible straight lines through my first edge. Something like this. So in blue is just our first function and this first function represents all the straight lines going through my first edge. Now, what I have done for the first edge, I can do also for my second edge. For the second edge, I can also put in all possible straight lines that go through the first edge, which have their own r and theta values. And all the possible ones in there will be again represented by some other function that maybe also looks a bit like a sine or somewhat differently in r theta space. So the new function for the second edge would be, again, a function that represents all straight lines going through the second edge. Now I keep doing this for all edges, not just the ones that I'm interested in, but it's also the ones around the apple, the shade of the apple. So I'm doing this, what I've just done, for all possible edges that I have in my image. And for each edge, I have a new function, and this function, again, represents all the straight lines going through there. And now I can calculate how these functions intersect. Some of them intersect a lot with each other, some don't. But I will find some point where I get most intersections of all these functions. And remember, each function represents all straight lines going through one specific edge. So I will do the voting here, and I will just count the intersections of these functions. And I will get clearly around here most intersections. And that intersection is a point. And you remember what a point in r theta space means. We just go back to here. A point in r theta space represents a specific straight line in my original image. Like this blue point represented this straight line. Now, when I find that one point in r theta space where most of these functions intersect, that point is essentially a straight line in my original image. And that one will be a straight line that I found in here. So I need to find a way to map back from r theta space to a straight line, but eventually mapping to r theta space and back is just basic geometry, which is fairly easy. And you've seen this with complex numbers, with the polar coordinates, how to do it. So what I'm getting is just a straight line. And that straight line is the one I'm looking for in the original image. So you see, we started with the original image, found features, selected some of the features, so the features were just edges, keep some of the edges. For each edge, find all the possible straight lines. This will be a function in r theta space. Do this for each of the features. And see the point where most of these functions intersect, and that one point, map it back to the original image. It's a straight line. So this is actually the simplest explanation I've ever found of the Hough transform. Are you okay with the Hough transform? Thumbs up, thumbs down, or any comments you may have. No, it's not that easy. And implementing it in code is obviously something that takes a little bit. Every year, some students' projects, they look, for example, into finding straight lines. I think last year there was someone, or 2 years ago, implementing the Hough transform and running it on some data. The question is, how do you get the lines from the intersections of the sine curves? So you would need to do some kind of interpolation, but there are lots of algorithms that can approximate this, or you would maybe approximate it and not have a continuous function here, but maybe you would shift these straight lines or rotate them just by a few degrees and try to find as many points as possible, and then either find some algorithm that does the interpolation for you, or you would somehow discretize this and run this just in a huge grid with possible points and see where you have the most intersections. So there are lots of ways how you can implement this. It takes a little bit of time to implement it. I've implemented it once myself. Wasn't too difficult actually, but there are also lots of libraries. So if you want to pick the Hough transform as a project, obviously my expectation would be that you implement it yourself. If you use the project, which you just use a library for the Hough transform, call it on a few examples, that would not be an adequate crew project for this course. So you would need to put in some more work than just calling a library. But I think, as I said, 1 or 2 years ago, someone actually implemented the Hough transform on their own. The only downside is the Hough transform is computationally quite heavy, so don't underestimate how long this may actually run on real-world data. There are, again, lots of variations of the Hough transform, trying to speed it up or using some discretization in order or reduce the size of such a discretization crit in order to speed it up. And there are, again, lots of variations of the Hough transform, not just for straight lines, but also for circles and so forth. So this approach can be amended to different geometries. It was initially proposed for straight lines decades ago, but nowadays it's been lots of variations have been proposed. So I'll tell you, if I was a student and it was explained in a lecture like this, I would have understood it on my first attempt far more, but it was explained probably more complex when I was a student and I didn't get much out of it. But this is the essence of the Hough transform. Now we've seen straight lines, we've applied the RANSAC algorithm to it, we've applied the Hough transform to straight lines. And the next feature we're interested in are corners. Corners differ from straight lines in quite a few ways. And why are corners so interesting? Corners are much more distinctive in an image than straight lines. Because if you have an object like this calculator and you put just, say, a small window of pixels somewhere in this calculator, like up here, and you will try to move this small window a little bit up to the left, right, down, whatever, you will see in such a uniform patch like here, you will not see a lot of changes because you just move your pixels around or your window a little bit around, and there will not be much changes in here. If you put your window around a straight line or at an edge of this calculator, and you move your window a little bit around, you will notice more changes, because if you move it along the direction of the edge, you will not observe much changes in your window. But if you move it to the right or left, so contrary or opposite to the direction of the edge, then you may see a lot of changes because you crossed that edge, so you could see a lot of pixels changing in the window. So the edge or the straight line is already more distinctive, but even more distinctive is a corner. Because if you put your window of pixels there and you just move it wherever, like up, down, left, right, around the corner, you will see a lot of pixels changing. So corners help us to set boundaries of elements. And corners are in fact quite interesting to work with as features when it later comes to finding objects in an image, maybe tracking objects in an image. For all of this, corners are quite a good start to build more higher level vision. So corners are quite low level vision like edges, but we can use them to build increasingly more complex features. Now, I will show you how we can actually find corners in an image. And for this, I will use my iPad. I hope all the iPad stuff works today. Should be working in a moment. I've updated the Zoom one, but screen share. Now, screen share should be working now. What I'll show you now is also available in the slides, but I don't like just presenting slides that contain lots of equations. So rather, we will build the Harris corner detector now step by step. And for well-formatted formulas, just look at the slides. So the Harris corner detector. What the Harris corner detector does is we have a window, which we call W, and this window is a small window of pixels that we shift throughout the image. And the shift is a vector D, so D is bold. In the slides, this is mentioned as UV transpose, so it's a row vector with elements U and V. In the slides, I use the row vector because it needs less vertical space, but you can also just write UV. So UV is a column vector, and UV as a row vector transposed is just we just transpose the row vector and turn it into a column vector. It's just a different representation. So we actually can put this more easy in the slides. Now, if I want to know the intensity of a pixel X and Y. So this is the intensity. So we are working with grayscale images. It's just the brightness. And I want to know the pixels X, Y in the window. So a window could be maybe a 10 times 10 pixel window, a 5 times 5 pixel window. So the window W defined up here. And I want to know the intensity at a pixel XY. But I told you we also want to shift that window a little bit around. So the shift was this one. So I want to shift the window by UV pixels. So UV is just a few pixels by which I'm shifting the window. And I want to find out, is there a corner in this window or not? And that means we've looked at corners before, and for the motivation, if I shift this window just by a few pixels somewhere in the image, and I find a lot of changes of intensity, then there could be a corner there. Could also be an edge or a straight line or a window. We need to classify this later. But if there are not much changes, then we've either shifted along an edge or somewhere in a uniform region of an object. But there's definitely no corner then if this change of pixels is very low when shifting the image or when shifting the window. So this, I will now have the following. I have my window XY, but I'm shifting this by UV. So X gets shifted by U and Y gets shifted by V. So this is the shift. And if I'm shifting the pixel or the window where it looked at XY and I'm shifting this by UV, which is just a few pixels, I will have a difference. And this difference of intensity can be positive or negative. So it's very important, and I'm just putting this in red. So we are squaring the difference of these intensities. And by squaring a difference is something you see in a lot of machine learning problems as well. Then it doesn't matter if the change was positive or negative. So it will be a positive change or just be zero. And small changes will count little, big changes count even more. So this is the idea of squaring the errors or squaring a difference. And this is now function E of UV. And why do I have a sum sign? this sum, I'm doing this for all the pixels x, y in my window. Because here I'm looking at pixels of individual pixels and their difference, but I need to do this for all the pixels in my window. And there's a question, how is intensity defined in terms of the numbers 0 to 255, as before. So this is 0 to 255. 0 is black, 255 is white. And I have these intensities, and the change may be positive or negative, I squared. And I go through the whole window. So if I have uniform patches, this will be near to 0. There will be still a little bit of change because of changes of intensities, even in largely uniform patches, but it will be close to 0 for uniform patches. And it will be large for distinctive patches, like corners could be large or somewhat large for an edge or a straight line as well, depending on how I shift the window. So later we need to separate corners from edges. So this is the idea of our corner detector. We will need a quick revision of a different math concept before amending this. And we will look at something that is, so it's just a math concept that we need now, and you have learned this in maths most likely before. Who of you remembers Taylor expansion or Taylor polynomials, Taylor series? There are lots of words for it. Thumbs up, green if you remember. If you don't remember or you never heard about Taylor expansion, send a red one. So at least one red one. So we'll quickly show this. I have a function f of x. And so this will be now a little bit of maths for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but we will need this for our corner detector. So a Taylor series of a real or complex valued function f of f is an indefinitely differentiable or that a function that is indefinitely. So I'll start again. Sorry. And I'll start again. So the Taylor series of a function, and the function must be infinitely differentiable at a real number or complex number, is the following series. I'll write a series f of a, and I'll first write it down, and then we look at what it means. So I have f of a. A is a concrete value, can be a real or a complex number, but we only care about real numbers today. So f prime of a is the first derivative divided by 1 factorial, and then x minus a, plus the second order derivative of f at a divided by 2 factorial times x minus a squared, plus the third order derivative of f at a divided by 3 factorial at x minus a cubed, and so forth. So we can approximate the function f of x, because sometimes we may want to have a very sophisticated function f of x, and we don't know what it actually looks like. But maybe we know some values of this function and its derivative at certain points, at certain concrete values a. And then this actually allows us to approximate the whole function around that area of a. And the sum that I have just written here can be written in short as something like, we have a sum where n starts at 0 and goes to infinite, because this function f must be infinitely differentiable. And I can say I want the nth derivative of f at a dividing by n factorial times x minus a to the power of n. So it's just a more compact representation. Now, what is this useful for? We will need it soon and apply it to our Harris corner detector. But we will look at an example. So, example. We all use our function cosine of x, but we don't know how to compute cosine of x. It's something for which you use your calculator. And I'll show you now how to find an approximation of your cosine function. And this is how it's actually implemented in various libraries, how to actually calculate the cosine function. So f of x, what's the first order derivative of the cosine? Let us know, turn on your mic or send it to the chat. What's the first order derivative of cosine of x?
I think sine or minus sine.
Minus sine of x. Then you can just stay with us. Don't turn off your mic. What's the second order derivative then? So we differentiate
Maybe
minus sine of x again. What is that one then?
maybe minus cosine.
Yes. And then the third order derivative is sine of x. And the fourth order derivative is cosine of x. So this just keeps repeating. Now we can use the Taylor expansion to approximate our cosine function, because we said, so f of x would be now the cosine function if we know its value at a concrete parameter a, and as well as for its derivatives, we can try to approximate what the cosine may look like. So let's try this. So we say our function f is not a cosine function, so it will be the cosine of a minus. So what we have now is f prime of a divided by 1 factorial x minus a. So the first derivative of the cosine is minus sine of x. That's why we have this minus sine at a. So it's not of x, but the concrete value a always that we put in the derivative divided by 1 factorial at x minus a. Then the next one is, we do this for the second order derivative, which is minus cosine at a, not at x, obviously. Dividing by 2 factorial, and we use x minus a squared. Then we will do this for the third order derivative, which is now a plus, because it's sine plus sine of a divided by 3 factorial at x minus a squared, and so forth. So far, we've put now this very generic one, and now we need to know some value a for which we know the concrete value of cosine and sine, and then we can try to evaluate it and approximate the cosine function. We could use, for example, a is 0. So we put in a 0 for a. And Unfortunately, I just noticed somehow this one came in here. So I don't know where this came from. Just by accident. So now it's corrected as it was. So we can plug in now a 0. We plug in a 0 here, 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 and here. So we can try to simplify this. We can say, so this will be eventually cosine of 0 is 1. The sine of 0 is 0, which will make all these sine terms disappear. I just noticed a small mistake I made. So it's all typeset well in the slides, but it's a live demo. So unfortunately, sometimes in this live demo, there are some small issues, but I try to fix them as I see them. So all these terms are 0, where sine of 0 is 0, so they disappear. So what stays are the cosine terms. And the cosine, so minus cosine of a, where a is 0, would be -1. And we divide by 2 factorial. So 2 factorial is 2. And then we have our x minus a. So x minus 0 is just x squared. And we would continue like this. While you're unable to run this up to infinite, you would run it maybe for n is up to 50 or whatever, and then you would get a much more precise approximation of this function. I will show you this now in the slides because it's all typeset well in the slides. So this is what I just showed you. And when n increases, it becomes better. In the slides, I also did it for the fourth order derivative. And we just keep doing this. And then an approximation of the cosine is like 1 minus x squared divided by 2 plus x to the 4 divided by 4 factorial and so forth. So you would just continue this and you actually get an approximation of the cosine function around 0. The Taylor expansion can be also done for several variables because we are now interested in several variables, not just in one variable, but the concept of the Taylor expansion can be used for several variables. This looks ultra complex, but it's just a generic expansion or generic generalization of the Taylor expansion, which I will not go through with you in detail. Rather, we will directly apply it to our Harris corner detector. It's just for you if you want to study the Taylor expansion in several variables in great detail with an example. Take a look at it and study it. What we had before is what I've shown you in my slides. What I had shown you on my whiteboard was this one here. This is the Harris corner detector. And we will go back to this now. So the screen share will be switched again to the iPad. And we will apply the Taylor expansion to this very soon. And that's why we did a quick revision of the Taylor expansion. So what we can do is we have our sum or our difference here. And this difference, we have one part of the difference, which is this change of intensity. And this one we need to re-express. So this is a function of two variables, x and y. And if we apply the Taylor expansion to this, it will actually become simpler. Concretely, we can say we have the intensity of x plus u and y plus v, we use the Taylor expansion. And this will give us, so if you study the Taylor expansion in several variables, or you just trust me, this will be approximated as following. It's the intensity of x and y, and then the change of the intensity along x, so these are partial derivatives, times u, plus the change of the intensity along y times v plus dot, 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 because it's infinitely differentiable. So we do dot, 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 but we actually only care about the Taylor expansion. So I write this Taylor expansion. We only care about the first three pieces of the Taylor expansion, concretely about these three. So the intensity of xy plus these two partial derivatives. And now we want to plug in those three in here. Instead of this intensity of x plus u and y plus v, we put in the first three components of the Taylor expansion. And I will write this out for you now. So the error of uv will be approximated, because we approximated the sum where x, y come from the window. And we just plug all of this in. So, maybe write this in red, what came from the Taylor expansion. So it's the intensity of xy plus the partial derivative of I along x times u plus the, well, doesn't look too great, partial derivative of I along y times v. And as before, from before up here, we had this intensity of x, y, and we square this difference. So we've just plugged in the Taylor expansion of the first term and the three first components. How would you simplify this now? Do you see something that we can simplify? If so, maybe send this in the chat or turn on your mic. Yes, we can eliminate these intensities. And there was one mistake, because this is unfortunately the issue of a live demo. It was all set correctly in the slides. This must obviously be a minus, because it was also up here a minus. Sorry, so you may have not seen it because I made that mistake. But it was correct up there. It's a minus, so the intensities will cancel each other out. So what we have left are these two terms. And these two terms are something we're going to use now, and we keep working with them. And soon we'll get a very interesting representation of this Harris corner detector. Concretely, we will define Ix as the intensity of I along X, and Iy is the change of the intensity along Y. And then, so these are just new symbols, Ix and Iy, for these ones up here, just that it becomes a little bit more readable. And again, if you want this well format, just look into the slides where all of this is shown. So we can say the error of uv is approximately, we just plug this in above in this new notation. So we have x, y in the window. We have our U and our V. These U and V's, they were just these ones from up there. And then we have these partial derivatives, but we just write out now Ix and Iy. Because instead of the partial derivatives, we just write Ix and Iy, and it becomes easier. And this is squared. We have the squaring up here. And the squaring can be done. And then we have our xy in the window, which is, so this is just simple math from school now that we remove the square. It's u squared times ix squared. We have a 2uv ix iy plus a v squared iy squared. Just simple high school maths. And now it turns out that this EUV can be represented in a different way, because we've removed the square and we have this now. So EUV can be represented in terms of a product of a vector and a matrix. So we have a row vector UV, and we multiply the row vector with a matrix. And the matrix is something like the sum of the Ix squared, the sum of the Iy squared in the first diagonal, and in the other diagonal, this is just the sum of Ix, Iy. So same here. And we need to multiply this with a column vector, which is uv. So this down here is exactly the same as above, just represented as a vector, as a row and column vector and a matrix. And this one can be represented, we can say the first vector is a row vector, so in bold, a vector D, and we transpose it because we want the column vector to be D. And M is the matrix. So this is D transposed, this is D, and the matrix is M. Now, are you all still familiar? So now we have this representation. And I told you when we have a big change of intensity, it can be an edge or a corner. And we still need to figure out if we're actually dealing with a corner. Who of you is still familiar with eigenvectors and eigenvalues from your introduction to linear algebra? Maybe green sticker or thumbs up if you're okay with eigenvectors and eigenvalues. If you're not familiar, red reaction. And maybe some more reactions, please. So, more negative ones than the positive ones. That's fine. We will briefly revise eigenvalues and eigenvectors. So, we will start with the revision. So, eigenvalues and eigenvectors. If you have a matrix A, so this is in bold a matrix A, and it's an n times n matrix, and you multiply it with some specific vector x, what you will get is, this doesn't work for all vectors, but for some specific vectors, your result will be your vector x multiplied a factor lambda. So you have an n times n matrix, and this does not apply to all matrices, but for some n times n matrices, they may have a vector, there may be a vector x, and if you multiply x from the right with your matrix, the next one you will get is a new vector x, which is multiplied by some factor lambda. If this holds true, so it doesn't work for all matrices, all vectors, whatever, but if that property holds true, then x is called an eigenvector of A, and your lambda is called an eigenvalue. What does that mean now? There are lots of interpretations what eigenvectors and eigenvalues do, and there are lots of applications of this. You can have a geometric representation, for example. Say we have a coordinate system of x, y, and we have a vector, for example, something like this. And if this is an eigenvector of a matrix, you can see the matrix actually as a projection to transform your vector. And what would happen then is that your vector could, for example, become longer. So if x is the eigen, so in bold x, obviously, if this is your eigenvector, so the blue one, eigenvector, and you multiply it with A, so if it's the eigenvector of A, then its direction changes, but it only becomes longer and shorter. And this one here, this length, this would be your eigenvalue. So for example, eigenvector is multiplied with its matrix or with the matrix, the projection, and its direction changes, but it gets the double length, then the eigenvalue is 2. You can also have negative eigenvalues, so you could flip it in the opposite direction. So this would be -2 or -0.5, so it would be shorter, but in the opposite direction. So this is a geometric interpretation of eigenvectors and eigenvalues. There are numerous applications for this, for example, in electrical engineering. I even heard about some applications in civil engineering. Maybe you can send me briefly here in the chat where you have come across eigenvectors and eigenvalues and what kind of applications you have seen. I'll give you a moment to respond to this. And let's just see if there's anyone who has seen any applications. Like in Maths 2, where have you used it for? Maybe let us know if you have seen any concrete applications of the eigenvectors and eigenvalues. In machine learning, you will need this for an algorithm that is called, for example, PCA, the principal component analysis. It's an unsupervised algorithm that allows you to reduce the dimension of a data set while keeping most of the variation in the data. But I guess when this is introduced in your Maths 2, oftentimes you don't see much applications, but it's just a concept and applications appear later. So one student wrote about solving differential equations, machine learning, stochastic processes. Yes, these are all applications of eigenvectors. Since this is taught in your maths too, I'm not discussing here in detail how to find eigenvalues and eigenvectors. Yet I understand you may be interested in maybe a revision for this. And for that, I will just quickly refer to my slides. So in the slides, I have a few more revision slides. So the equation I've just shown you, an explanation of or interpretation what eigenvalues and eigenvectors are for. And here there are a few more slides of how you can find them, also with examples. Yet since it's taught in your math too, I won't be discussing this now in detail, but you just see a matrix and we find its eigenvalues and then its corresponding eigenvectors. So there are examples in here. Why is this now interesting for our Harris corner detector? You have seen just before we had our error terms, or the error is we move the window by a few pixels UV, and we want to calculate that error. So it was a lot of work to get to this representation because we first needed to see how the intensity changes. Then we've applied the Taylor expansion, and eventually we could write this in a combination of vectors and matrices. And key to this is now this matrix M. And matrix M is a 2 times 2 matrix, and this one has some interesting properties. Concretely, we can calculate the so-called corner response. And the corner response is called R, and for this we need lambda 1 and lambda 2. Lambda 1 and lambda 2 are the eigenvalues of our matrix M, so this compact matrix we had just seen. And if I calculate lambda 1 times lambda 2 minus something, concretely, this is the sum of the two eigenvalues squared plus this product is multiplied with a small factor k. This small factor k is often between 0.04 and 0.06. If I calculate this is called R, and it's the corner response. And the corner response is an indication of if there's actually a corner or not. Because what we may have there, maybe it's not a corner, maybe it's an edge, maybe it's just a uniform patch. So R is something very distinctive, and if R is large, there's probably a corner in that window because we have shifted the window a little bit and calculate a large corner response. And the corner response, in order for this to calculate, we need the eigenvalues. And for the eigenvalues, we needed to build this matrix, which we could only build after we had simplified the terms and calculated the Taylor expansion. Now comes one thing. We need to have this window and we need to shift this window around a lot in our image. So there will be lots of windows because we need to place the windows all over and shift them all over by a few pixels. So we generate this many, many times. Now finding the eigenvalues is computationally expensive. So we can't just do it this way. If we want to speed it up, we can actually calculate the corner response in a slightly different way. It's just an approximation, but it can be done by we take the determinant of M. Who of you is still familiar with the determinant of a matrix? Thumbs up or thumbs down? So only positive. If you're not familiar with the determinant, just look it up because this is one of the key concepts in linear algebra. And we subtract another term. We take the trace of M and we square the trace of M and multiply it again with our constant K, and we subtract that from the determinant. Who of you knows what the trace is? The trace of a matrix, thumbs up or thumbs down? So just half, then that's fine. No, actually more negative ones. Then I'll quickly show you what the trace of a matrix is. So determinant and trace. So let's say I have a matrix M and it's just the values 2, 1, 3, and 4. What's the determinant of M? So what's the determinant of this? Who remembers how to calculate a determinant for a 2 times 2 matrix? If you remember this, just send this to the chat. So some people responded they know what the determinant is. So it's just the product of the first diagonal minus the product of the other diagonal. So the determinant of this data set of this matrix is 2 times 4 minus 3.1, 3 times 1. So it's 8 minus 3, it's 5. So this is the determinant. If you have larger matrices, you need or a slightly different algorithm to do this, a more generic one. And the trace, this is now the new thing for most of you, the trace of M is just the sum of the diagonal. So the trace of M here is 2 plus 4 is 6. And this trace is easy to compute for any square matrix. You just sum up the elements in the diagonal. So we can approximate the corner response R as the determinant of our matrix M that we saw before, minus the trace squared multiplied with our empirically determined constant. Now we have built a Harris corner detector and we look at a few observations. Something you will see here is, say, we apply the Harris corner detector here to multiple parts of the image. For example, to this one up here. What we see in this up here is there's not much of a corner, more like an edge. And what we see plotted here are the two eigenvalues, lambda 1 and lambda 2, when we move this image a little, or when we move this window a little bit around, we see all the eigenvalues plotted. And we see lambda 1 and lambda 2 quite close to each other, so they don't differ too much. Also here, we see they spread out, but they don't differ too much. But they are overall maybe quite large, maybe, depending on what's small and large. Now down here, we have this patch, and we see that one lambda is typically bigger than the other lambda. While in this patch here, we don't see much. Again, the lambdas spread out, but they don't differ too much. But if we apply the Harris corner detector, for example, to this one here, we will see there's quite some pattern in these lambdas, maybe also here. So maybe you can try to generalize what the eigenvalues may look like if you have a corner. For corners, if you have corners, typically the two lambdas are both large. Lambda 1 and lambda 2 are large if you have corners. For a uniform region, both lambdas are typically small. And if one lambda is much bigger than the other lambda, so this is shown here much bigger, then typically you have an edge. This makes sense here because we have this edge here. One lambda is much bigger than the other. The green one, we see they are both large. And maybe for such a region, which is maybe quite uniform, well, it's not too uniform, maybe you find some simple corners in here, but overall these values are smaller. And up here, maybe also there's no clear corner, rather it's a bit of a uniform patch, but maybe with some noise. If you applied this now on a very uniform patch, like maybe down here or somewhere, or here, say here, then you would see that probably both lambdas are quite small. So if both lambdas are large, then we have a corner. If one is much larger than the other, we typically tend to have a patch. We tend to have an edge. And if both are small, then we typically have a uniform region. It all depends on also customizing your K. Sometimes in the literature, it's not a K, it's a kappa, but I just, in order to simplify the looking, I put in a K here, and this is typically an empirically determined constant that is usually between 0.04 and 0.06. If you apply the Harris corner detector to this sample image here, you will find lots of corners. There is noise. Maybe you're not interested in something like this down here or something to up here, because it's maybe not a corner. This has to do with the noise and whether your Harris corner detector is invariant to noise. But it also gives us quite reasonable corners, like around here, for example, up to here. So maybe this Harris corner detector could be calibrated better, but it initially gives us quite some good corners, also up here. And these corners would then be used in a more high-level vision task, for example, for tracking, for object recognition, and so forth. Concretely, the Harris corner detector is okay invariant to translation and rotation, but it's not invariant to scale. So scale means the object is further away or closer to the camera. This, in fact, has impact also on your window, on how many pixels, or well, not the pixels, but the number of pixels that you have in the window, how much they represent in the image. So if you scale very, very far away, maybe you just miss some of the corners because they're not that distinctive anymore. But it's okay invariant to translation and rotation. But if you add noise, illumination, whatever, shades, then this has impact on your Harris corner detector too. So what we have seen today is we have actually built a an algorithm in detail that can find us corners in images. And you need lots of maths for this from your first year. So you see your first year maths is important, that you know about linear algebra, that you know the Taylor expansion, that you know eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And I know this will take a little bit of time to revise. It's not an easy algorithm, but we just want to show you that computer vision is lots of maths and that your first year maths is certainly important. There are much more other feature detectors. We've seen 3 feature detectors today. We've seen, as a very generic one, the RANSAC. Then we've seen the Hough transform for finding straight lines. And now we saw how to find corners with the Harris corner detector. And there are other feature detectors. SIFT is a very popular one, the scale invariant feature transform, a very sophisticated feature detector that gives us lots of features that are scale invariant, yet it's a very difficult to, the approach is very difficult to understand. So it would take you quite some time to study it. And there are lots of other feature detectors like Hough, the histogram of oriented gradients, DOG, the difference of Gaussians. We could fill the whole term just with more feature detectors, but I picked some that I feel are overall helpful, that are understandable, and that we're able to discuss. Maybe for SIFT, we would need 3 to 4 weeks, but we want to do some other stuff in this course than just SIFT. So I picked the Harris corner detector, which is sufficiently complex and usable, yet it's something we're able to discuss in an hour or so, as well as the Hough transform and RANSAC as a very generic one. as I said, next week there's no lecture. You should use next week for revision and pick up robots if you wish. I've posted in iLearn when and where to pick the robots from Mr. Rankel, and he is your contact person in case of any issues with the robots. In 2 weeks, we'll have this lecture again, and we will do object recognition, and we look at various approaches to object recognition using the features we have now found. We have seen different features. This week, corners and straight lines, last week, edges, and we can use these features in more high-level tasks for finding objects, tracking objects, all of this. So next week, we look at various challenges of object recognition. We see template matching, we see histograms. Histograms and templates can be used for object recognition. And then we look at machine learning. And machine learning is something we've already seen today for clustering, but we will use machine learning for object recognition. And then in the next lecture, we will not just start with object recognition, but we look into convolutional neural networks, which are very helpful for learning features and concrete tasks in computer vision. And then we've made lots of progress, and you will already maybe have some ideas for your projects. And then in the following weeks, we look at other things like image sequences and so forth. I know today was tough, and we spent the whole 3 hours on this. So spend enough time on the revision or try to implement some of these algorithms to get some extra practice. Any questions from your side for the end now? If you're okay, thumbs up. If you're not okay, maybe thumbs down. So I'll see if I need to wait for any questions you may have. With there not being any questions, I wish you a great remaining week, and I look forward to seeing you in the lecture in 2 weeks, and enjoy picking your robot next week. Take care and bye-bye.